All right, so let's start with this, today's topic. Now, I'm going to turn off the light. Hopefully everybody can see up front and in the back. Yes, everybody good with the lighting? All right. So, all right. What I want to start off with is basically what this class is about. The class is called Modern World History, right? What does that mean? What does it basically mean? In a college class, you have to have some kinds of boundaries to give an idea of what the beginning and end is to a particular topic, right? Unlike math, science, education, nursing, there is no clear beginning and end. The people that write those textbooks, they say, we want you to learn these things at the completion of this class. And they're basically themes that you cover. For history class, everything is by dates. Everything is chronological. And in this particular case, modern world history, across universities in North America, the assumption is that on or around 1500, the modern world began. Now, it's no coincidence that 1500 is around the time Christopher Columbus landed in the New World and began the years of European immigration into the New World. It's not a coincidence. It's also not a coincidence that in the early 1500s, besides the colonization of North and South America, you also had the beginning of the biggest crisis in Christianity that split Christianity between Protestants and Catholics and defined the history of the world in the West, in the Christian world, thereafter. So that's more or less why 1500 is our beginning period. Technically, this is History 202. History 201 is a period before this, sort of from the earliest human civilizations in the Middle East leading up to around 1500s. We'll start in this period and we'll go to after World War II into the 1990s. Of course, as it is modern world history, we can't do everything. We just don't have that kind of time. So I'm going to focus on major themes that characterize how global history moved in the past 500 years. Okay? Now, perforce, much of this is going to be on the West in the early period, Europe and America. Why? Are they better than all other cultures? Absolutely not. But whether we like it or not, whether we're comfortable with it or not, beginning with the period when Western European nations, England, France, eventually Germany, eventually Italy, Spain, Portugal, when they started colonizing North, Central, and South America, when they started sailing around and then landing in Africa, eventually going to Asia, these Western cultures, Lorenzo, close the door behind you. These Western cultures, because of a fluke, were technologically ahead of the peoples that they came into contact with. They also brought with them diseases that the peoples that they came into contact with could not resist, and the result was the virtual extermination of the visited cultures or their conquest. It is not a coincidence that one of the most popular, as in most spoken languages in the world, are English and French. That's not because English and French are easier, and then if you throw into Spanish as well, and most of the world speaks languages that derive from Western Europe. Okay? Now, these languages aren't easier than other languages, but they are the languages of the conquerors. England, France, Spain, Portugal. This is just a natural and unfortunate byproduct of military conquest, is cultural expansion. But it cuts both ways. Islam is practiced throughout the Middle East. North Africa, Central Africa, East and West Africa. Why? The armies of the Prophet Muhammad, as well as the people that came after him, as well as Muslim missionaries. Hinduism, the most, as well as Buddhism, the most popular religions of India and Southeast Asia. Why? Missionaries, but also missionaries who followed after conquering armies. This has happened throughout history. It's not unique to the modern world, but in the modern era, it was Western Europe and then eventually America that happened to be more technologically advanced, more wealthy, and were able to conquer and impose their culture, their economy, their society on the societies they came into contact with. And some were simply exterminated, either on principle or by the spread of diseases, which that was either done on purpose or by accident. Not by accident, just a natural byproduct of two cultures coming together. So that's the modern world. And where do we start? This is just an outline of what I'm talking about today, state building society in early modern Europe. That is one of the first major themes of the modern era, a strong central government. Do I have a list here? I do. Yeah. One of the things that defines the modern era is a strong central government. Now, you may not know what that is specifically because you've always had it. Do you know who's in charge of foreign policy going to war in this country? Who is it? The governor of New York, the mayor of New York, or the president of the United States? The president of the United States. Who would you expect to fix the potholes in the city of New York? The mayor, the governor, or the president? The mayor. So obviously we have different levels of government that have specific responsibilities. You follow me? Okay. And the mayor, it would never occur to him to declare war on Korea, right? It's absolutely none of his business. On the same level, the president of the United States, it would never occur to him to get involved in local issues, public schools, potholes, law enforcement, right? This is all local government. And the reason we have these division of powers is because we've come to realize after years of experience that if you make it specific what certain levels of government can do, there's no confusion, there's no waste of time, there's no waste of money, and the people are governed effectively. You follow me so far? Okay. Now, it wasn't always like this. The reason why we ended up with this very specific division of power as to who was supposed to do what and who should not interfere in somebody else's business, this happened because of the modern era. The world just got too complicated. Populations expanded too much. The people needed too many things from their government. The people were no longer as homogeneous or similar as they used to be. Different races, ethnicities, religions, expectations were now living one on top of the other. Cities were no longer a few thousand, they were millions of people. So government had to be much more efficient. That is the consequence of the modern era. Before the modern era, when cities were smaller, populations were much more similar, everybody had the same history, religion, expectations, government didn't have to be complicated. It was easy. You have a king. Just do what the king tells you. If you don't, you get killed. Easy. But then you add into that religion. Before, when everybody was a Christian, for instance, in Europe, it was easy. The Pope is the head of the Christian church. What he says is what you do. If you don't, you go to hell. End of story. It was very uncomplicated. Things got way more complicated when governments needed to be stronger, more efficient, demanded more of its people, and the people wanted more from its government, like the right to vote, right? And then what happens when churches break apart? When not everybody is a Christian anymore, or at least one type of Christian. Now you have Catholics and Protestants. And you know religion, people kill over this stuff. And before the modern era, there was no strong central government. You had kings. The king's power was not absolute. That only came later. Kings were sharing power with nobles, with religious leaders, and that kind of weak central government just didn't work in the modern era. That's A. There's two models of strong central government that I'm going to talk about in the next two classes. The absolute monarchy of Louis XIV. Louis XIV showed that to handle the modern world, kings had to have absolute control. The economy, politics, society, religion, all had to be controlled by the king. And how did he get that absolute centralized national power? Through intimidation, fear, and bribery. And all of that I'll cover at the end of this class. The other model of strong central government, which England adopted, which was then transported to all of the British Empire, and by the British Empire I mean America, Canada, Jamaica, New Zealand, Australia, the African colonies, was a parliamentary system of government where the king is not absolute. The king has to share power with the people, and the people are represented by Parliament. Our Congress is part of that system, where the President shares power with Congress, shares power with the Supreme Court, checks and balances. Because the idea is you put too much power in the hands of one group, they become corrupt. Here, they're not concerned about corruption. They want stability, so give all the power to one person. In England, the constitutional monarchy was the result of this desire for strong central government. These are the two models of strong central government that define the modern era. But the one that survived and then was adopted by every other nation on the planet that's not under a dictatorship is the system of constitutional monarchy. Even if you don't have a king, the basic principles are there. There has to be checks and balances between the one person in charge of everything, the executive, and a body that represents the people, whether it's Parliament, Congress, Chamber of Deputies, Senate, call it whatever you want. The king enforces the laws, or president in our case. The Congress, or Parliament in the English case, makes the laws. And then the courts, they interpret the constitutionality. So that's one of the foundations of the modern era that makes the modern era different than the pre-modern or medieval ages. The other foundation of the modern era is the economy. Nowadays, before 1500, the most common form of economy was farming. Land was the symbol of your wealth. Today, the symbol of your wealth is the size of your bank account. Wherever your money comes from, it doesn't matter. Whether it's tech stocks, farming, mining, banking, doesn't matter. How much money you got in your account is a symbol of your wealth. Before 1500, the most common form of wealth, the most common form of making money is simply farming. Whether you were a farmer that worked for somebody else, a farmer that owned a small piece of land, or a farmer that owned hundreds of acres and people worked for you. There was really no other way to make. There was, of course, a few bankers. There was a few lawyers, doctors, etc. But the most overwhelming symbol and way of making money was farming. This changes. Beginning in the 1600s, there's an industrial revolution. Things are no longer made by hand, they're made in a factory through machines. Wealth increases exponentially. And we'll talk about that in a future class. The other consequence of the Industrial Revolution, before, when everybody made everything they needed at home, manufacturing was very small scale. You needed a shirt, you made it at home. You needed shoes, you made them at home. Or you went to the local skilled craftsman just down the street, and you place an order, and a month later you get your suit, your shoes, your table, whatever. When you start concentrating manufacturing in a factory, those factories draw people in for work. And all of a sudden, wherever you place a factory, people start coming in for work, and the population of that village, that town, starts to increase. Now all of a sudden you got a city. And cities start growing as the factories expand, because everyone is going to where the work is in the Industrial Revolution. And this is what's known as urbanization, the growth of cities. More and more people move from the countryside into the city. And urbanization is important. Why? Because you take a population that's living scattered in the countryside, and the only people they ever talk to is their family, maybe their neighbors, and maybe they come together when they go to church. That's it. No internet, no phone, no telegraph. Information is spread by word of mouth. And you don't talk to that many people. And the people you do talk to are all just like you. Little education, all farmers, and they just go to church and do what they're told. When you start living in cities, you're not surrounded by family and friends. Many people move on their own. You're now surrounded by a bunch of strangers, and you all have the same experience. You left your family back home, you're living in a new place, new culture, new job, you don't know anybody, but you're all working at the same factory, and you're all working long hours at crappy pay, living in a crappy apartment. You probably don't have the vote. There's no public education for you or your kids. Excuse me. My point is, when you put that many people living on top of each other and they're not happy with their lot in life, they're going to start talking about it. They're going to see how much they have in common. And when people who are unhappy start talking to each other about what they have in common, then you have organization. Working class organization, political organization, social movements organization, feminism, things like that. That doesn't happen in the countryside when people are spread out and they don't talk to anybody else, because it takes you a day to walk to the closest village. Right? That's urbanization. It's the spread of ideas. Modern thinking. What makes it different than pre-modern thinking? You're taking out religion. You're taking out religion. That is what secular thinking is. Thinking that is based purely on cause and effect, not religion. If you don't have an answer to something, you just keep looking. Through trial and error, experimentation, you don't refer to the supernatural, whatever God you pray to. Okay? Now, why? Is religion bad? Of course not. But as I mentioned earlier, religion gets more complex in the modern era. Not everybody is a Christian and just Christian. Protestants break away from Catholicism. Protestants break off into many, many different small groups. And the initial reaction to the breakup of the Christian church was to try and kill the other side. Catholics tried to eliminate Protestants. Protestants tried to eliminate Catholics. And of course, that never happened. And what you have is generations of devastating warfare. So somebody came up with the idea of the separation of church and state. Why? Did they not believe in God? No, but they believed that if you keep killing your neighbor because you disagree with how to practice your faith, you're going to end up with nobody. And you can't convince people to change their faith. You can convince them to fake it, but you can't convince them to truly believe in what you believe. And if you don't have real faith, then what's the point of having faith in the first place? You either believe or you don't. So take religion out of how you organize your day-to-day life and focus just on rationalism. And what is rationalism? Can I prove it? Here's a problem, here's my answer. Does the answer solve the problem? Yes. Then that is the answer to the problem. If it doesn't work, don't do it. Try something else. What about tradition? Has tradition caused more problems or caused solutions? That is the only way to look at it. Modern rational thinking was everything that comes behind us, if it's not helping you, stop doing it. This has got nothing to do with do you believe in God or not. It only has to do with how do we live on this planet with a bunch of people that don't agree with me. We can either kill them all or just separate church from state, and then if there is a God in whatever heaven you believe in, he or she will sort out who's right, who's wrong. That is the thinking of the modern way of thinking. The other part of it is individualism. What does that mean? Selfishness? No. Before the 1500s started in, again, Western Europe, life was hard. Life was just hard. The winters were long. Food production was unstable. People would starve to death if they didn't grow enough food during the farming months, spring, summer, early fall. And they didn't have enough to get them through the winter. People starved to death. There were diseases everywhere because we didn't have modern medicines, soap, things like that. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for women. Infants usually didn't last after the first few months because of, again, poor food, hygiene, medicine. The elderly, they didn't live to 80, 90 years of age like today. They were dead by their 50s because life was just hard. So how do you survive in such a tough environment? Oh, and by the way, I forgot, wars. There was always wars going on. And the people that suffer the most during wars are the poor. Because farming gets disrupted if armies are fighting out in the fields. If there's no food, you starve. And armies that travel bring diseases with them. Plus armies, kill people. When life is that hard, how do you survive? You survive by making decisions that benefit the community. What does that mean? Let's say you ration how much food can be consumed per family, because the food needs to be shared. Let's say you make decisions about how to organize your society, because that has the most benefits. For instance, all marriages must take place in a church, following certain standards. Why? Because in the past it has shown that that guarantees that the marriage will survive, and you need to have the family as the unit of the village. Or maybe you outlaw drinking on Sundays, because you need the people working on Sundays. These are decisions based on what's good for the community, and individual differences don't matter because you're on the edge of survival. But beginning in the 15, 16, and especially the 1700s, life just gets easier. The weather gets warmer. There's revolutions in farming, so you could produce more food. There's revolutions in industry, so clothing is less expensive. People stay warmer. Medicine advances. People just simply live longer. When you have been pulled back from the edge of just misery, when you're not going to die if you just don't follow every single rule placed in front of you, you start thinking about yourself. How do you fit into society? Before, you would never ask the question, because if you don't go along with society, you'd be dead. You'd starve during the winter. Or you'd be cast out by your church, or kicked out of your village, because there's no room for dissent. But all of a sudden, life isn't so complicated. It's easier to get around from point A to point B. Lots of jobs available. Food is less expensive. Life is a bit easier. You're not comfortable taking orders and no longer asking questions 100% of the time. You start thinking about the individual and less about the community. Now, does this go down the road of selfishness? Of course. But if you start focusing on those individual needs, and enough people have common individual needs, that becomes the new normal, the new societal expectation. Let me give you an example. Women got the vote in this country in 1920, right? Before women got the vote, before there was a feminist movement, individual women would express frustration that they had education, but they didn't have the right to vote. But that wasn't a movement. It was just an individual number of women. And I'll talk about that as we get closer and closer to that period. But once these individual women started getting together and saying, you know, there's actually quite a lot of us who demand and are entitled to the right to vote, now you have a movement. And by 1920, that movement changes the laws, and now the new normal in America is that women have the right to vote. You understand what I'm saying? From the individual, a new community standard. So let's back it up to what I first started talking about. One of the earliest foundation of the modern world that I want to talk about: strong central government. As a response to the chaos of the modern world, you needed somebody in charge to bring order to all the new problems that the modern world had brought to us. As I mentioned, there's two models I want to look at. Today, absolutism. Wednesday, constitutional monarchy. Absolutism is easy. The king has complete control. And I'll talk about what that means in a second. But think about our president nowadays. Our president can enforce the laws, but he can't make the laws. An absolute king can enforce and make the laws. Our president nominates judges to the Supreme Court, but he can't fire them. An absolute king nominates judges to his courts, and he can fire them whenever he wants. And he doesn't have to listen to their judgments. In an absolute monarchy, the king is the judge, the jury, and the executioner. The economy, in an absolute monarchy, the king decides taxes, salary, price of goods, import-export tariffs, what country you can trade with and not. The king decides that. He has ministers and all that stuff to give him advice, but the king decides on his own. Sometimes there's a queen, but mostly they're kings. And in case you don't know, kings inherit their title from their father that came before them. Maybe another relative. Kings are not elected. They're not elected. Which cuts both ways. If you get a brilliant king that inherits the throne, you're golden. You have a great ruler for the next 30, 40 years. But if you get an idiot who's next in line because he's just the next in line, well then you're screwed for the next 30 or 40 years. And all those decisions I just talked about, religion, economics, warfare, trade, taxes, are in the hands of a not very smart person who takes advice from ministers who he's chosen, but he can't actually argue with because he's not very smart to begin with. So kings are 50-50. Louis XIV ruled for over 50 years, and he was brilliant, strong, ruthless, and cruel. But France was never more powerful as under Louis XIV, and stable. But there was no individual rights. You could be Louis's best friend on Monday, and by Friday afternoon, if you pissed him off, you, your family would be arrested, your property seized, you're likely going to be dead by the next Monday morning, and your property dispersed to all of Louis's other friends. And you're made an example of what happens if you disagree with the king. And you never quite know what he's going to be supporting, because he wakes up and he changes his mind. Constitutionalism is different. The king enforces the laws, but Parliament, that represents the people, and you actually have to elect the members of Parliament, they make the laws. The Parliament, like our Congress, represents the people. Now, back then, it wasn't democratic like ours is, where virtually everybody has the right to vote. Back then, only the wealthiest had the vote to elect members to Parliament. But it was a beginning. and eventually that voting base expanded. Let me ask you this. Of all the decisions a government makes, what decisions usually affect you on a most personal level that you feel immediately? What decisions taken by our government today you actually feel right away? Warfare probably won't affect you unless you're fighting or you know someone who's fighting, right? Yeah?
Like, say how Obama's like talking about keeping free financial aid to those going to community college, like, that will affect us. Right?
Yes. And how do you pay for financial aid to community college students? How do you get the money for that? Taxes. And who pays those taxes? Everybody. Taxes, there's a saying that says there's two things that will always be around: death and taxes. Everyone's going to die, and everyone's always going to pay taxes. Now, whether or not you pay your fair share is a whole other conversation. But the one decision that every government has made in the history of humankind that everybody feels right away, and they either like or get pissed off about, is about taxes. Because that is money going out of your pocket into a big pot, which is then used to pay for whatever. War, education, hospitals, roads, whatever. Right? Parliament controls money. If you're a king in a constitutional monarchy and you want to go to war, how do you go to war without money? How do you do it? How do you raise an army with no money? How do you build a navy with no money? You don't. So as a king, you are like our president, the commander-in-chief, but you're not going to go to war if your parliament is not going to give you money. This parliament represents the people. And with one thing that the people are most defensive of is the money in their pocket. Right? Question? No? They say taxes and you're smiling, so I'm wondering why. Oh, okay. All right then. So, why do you need such strong central government? What is so wrong with the way things were being done before, where the king works with some nobles and he shares power with them, the king shares power with some religious leaders, and everybody has their place. Everybody does their little thing. The problem is that starting in the 15 and 1600s, the world has gotten messy. And one of the reasons why the world has gotten messy is religion. Up until the early 1500s, most of Europe was Christian. And it took its orders about how to practice the Christian faith from one guy, the Pope, who is in the Vatican in Rome, in Italy. That's it. What he says about how you interpret the Bible, to whom you give money when you're in the churches, how that money is spent, how you're supposed to practice the faith so that when you die you go to heaven and not hell, all of those decisions were in the hands of one guy, as they are today in the Catholic Church, the Pope. And if you disagreed, well, there was trouble. Because at this time, kings were in strong alliance with religious leaders because most of the populations were Christian. They believed that when they died, they were going to heaven or hell, and the only one who could tell you which one you're going to is the Pope and his followers, the priests and the bishops. So do what they tell you. If you follow the religious leaders, your soul is saved. If you follow the king, your body will not be, killed. So, what happened to make things crazy? In the early 1500s, a guy by the name of Martin Luther, a name which sounds familiar because you're probably thinking of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. But Martin Luther, the theologian from Germany in the early 1500s, had some problems with the Christian church. Now, what problems? The Christian church is incredibly big and incredibly wealthy. That money has come from donations, that money has come from land, and that money has come from its alliances with political regimes, kings, etc. Now, all wealth inevitably corrupts, on some level, the person that gets this wealth. And Martin Luther, who was a religious scholar as well as a priest, looked at the Christian church of his time, and he saw an organization which was incredibly wealthy, but it seemed to stop doing what it was supposed to do. And all religions, the only reason religion exists is to make sure that when you die, you're going to whatever heaven you believe in, and not to whatever hell you believe in. That's the only reason for religion. It gives you a guide for how to live on this planet while you're alive. Well, Martin Luther looked at the incredibly wealthy Christian church of the early 1500s and said, I look around me, I see a pope, I see cardinals, I see bishops, the richest men in the world. I see them taking donations from poor people and using those donations to build cathedrals. But I don't see them helping the poor. I see them taking money from the poor. So I don't understand. Jesus Christ was a poor person. The early church was for poor people. How is the church now filled with wealthy people and the poor support this organization? How are we helping the poor? Now, Martin Luther didn't keep his opinions to himself. He published his opinions. He actually wrote them out. These are all the problems with the Christian church. And he nailed them on his door on his church in Germany for everybody else to see. It was a public condemnation of the Pope and the Christian church. How many Catholic churches exist today? How many Catholic churches exist today? I don't mean the actual buildings, but I mean, how many types of Catholicism are there today? Do you know? One. There's only one Catholicism today, headed by the Pope in Rome. If you don't like it, you're free to leave. If you stay in the church and start practicing things that are not of the Catholic faith, you just get kicked out. Back then, Luther was warned. Keep these opinions to yourself. You don't have the right to question the Pope, who, in the eyes of the church, is the direct messenger of God. You are just a lowly priest, right? But Luther didn't keep his opinions to himself. Why? Because he believed, you know what? I've read my Bible thoroughly, and what you all are doing over there is not in the Bible. Your policies are not in the Bible. And we all know that the Bible is the Word of God. So if you are interpreting the will of God, and we have the Bible, and you're not doing what's in the Bible, then what the hell are you doing? Go ahead, sir. Yes. Absolutely. Luther didn't keep his mouth shut. In spite of the warnings, in spite of the threats, he didn't keep his mouth shut. And most importantly, he had protection. The people of Germany and Northern Europe, but also more importantly with Luther, his own political protectors, they gave him the protection to keep saying what he wanted, because the Catholics could not send up forces to shut him down. And slowly but surely, he gives birth to a brand new religion, the Lutheran religion. And it's not just him. John Calvin in Holland comes up with a new Protestant religion. John Zwingli in Switzerland comes up with a new Protestant religion. Slowly but surely you have Baptists, Methodists developing year after year. One Catholic faith, many, many Protestant faiths. This is what's known as the Reformation. So now you have a problem. In France, the kings had traditionally been Catholic, very close to the Pope in Rome. But now, his subjects, the people that are owe loyalty to him, the king, they don't share his faith anymore. So now the subjects, the French, the people, they have divided loyalties. Do they follow their king or do they follow their faith? And what you have is tension there. which eventually boils over into civil war, because the kings get nervous. If people could start making choices about their own religion, then maybe they'll start making choices about what laws to follow and not. And so you start having civil war between Protestants and Catholics. And France is a majority Catholic country, so the Protestants got massacred, but they didn't go away. In England, it gets even more complicated. The king decides to leave the Catholic Church, start his own church, the Anglican Church, where the King of England is also the head of the King of the Church in England. His name was Henry VIII. Why did he start his own church? Was he upset with the Pope? Not really, he just needed a divorce. He had been married to the same woman for a while. She wasn't producing a son. He needed someone to pass his kingdom to. The Pope said, divorce is not legal in the Catholic Church. I'm not giving you a divorce. And there's no room for negotiation, because the woman you're divorcing, it's far too politically important. So the King of England says, fine, I'll just create my own religion, wherein divorce is legal. End of story. Well, how is that problematic? Well, there was a lot of people in England that were Catholic that didn't want to leave the Catholic faith. So now you have a division between the Catholic English men and women and their Protestant king. So who do they follow? The Pope, or they follow their king? But it gets even more complicated in England. When the King of England left the Catholic Church and he said, I'm starting a new religion, there was a bunch of people in England known as Puritans that argued, we need to purify England of all semblance of the Catholic faith, because the Catholic faith is the corruption of the Word of God. We have to purify our religion. Those guys, the Puritans, were extreme. They were so extreme that eventually they were kicked out of England and they landed in Boston, Massachusetts and set up a colony there. That's how extreme they were. Nobody wanted them. So now in England, you've got a Protestant king, Catholic subjects, but even Protestant subjects that are more extreme than the king. So you see what I'm saying? And you know religion. Have you ever had a productive conversation about religion with anybody? No, you avoid the topic because you don't want to piss the other person off or offend them. Because maybe they have a faith, maybe they don't have a faith. But either way, unless you are 100% in agreement with their points of views, you're going to disagree. And there's no room in religion to be, you either believe or you don't. Like politics. People tend to be pretty intolerant about different political systems. So we avoid the topic. You can't avoid the topic if it's a Protestant king and Catholic subjects, or a Catholic king and Protestant subjects. You can't avoid it. Go ahead. Extreme Puritans? All right. The Puritans believed that, let's see, the people have the ability to interpret the Word of God individually. They don't need someone in the middle. In the Catholic faith, right? You read the Bible, so on and so forth, but the priest is a strong influence on how you interpret the Word of God in the Bible. In the Protestant faith, especially in the Puritan faith, the goal is you, the individual. You learn to read. You read the Bible. You interpret the Word of God on your own. All right? That is the privilege. Not somebody else telling you what to think. You do it on your own. In the Puritan services, has anyone ever been into a Catholic church or cathedral in here? Right? Lots of stained glass, very big, very wealthy, you're meant to be impressed. In Puritan services, it's very basic. Very basic. It's like a meeting room like this. It's all about the Word of God. It's not about the decorations. Well, to the Catholics, anything that disagrees with the way they want to do things is a challenge to the faith and a problem. Like I said before, How many Catholic churches are there nowadays? One. How many Protestant churches are there? Hundreds. Hundreds and hundreds. I'm not saying one is better than the other. What I'm saying is Catholics believe there's only one God, and the only way to maintain, and one way to worship that God, and the only way to maintain that discipline is through a military structure where the orders go from the top all the way down. If you disagree, you get kicked out. Go.
Is Protestant like anything besides Catholic?
Yeah, you can be a Protestant and be a Baptist, a Methodist, a Lutheran, Episcopalian. You can be an evangelical Protestant, which is those original ones, but even more, I don't even know what the word is, much more, I take it back. I can't give you a good example. But yeah, there are many. There's Seventh-day Adventists. There's Plymouth Rock Methodists. There's hundreds and hundreds of different Protestant denominations and churches. The one thing they all have in common is that they're not Catholic. They're not Catholic. Now then, what other type of chaos emerged in the 16 and late 1500s that a strong central government was a response to? Rebellious nobles. What does that mean? Go ahead. No, the nobles were at the top of the pyramid. Yeah. Yeah. Even today, the few that are left over. Go ahead.
Would lords and nobles be considered the same thing back then?
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're like the governors in their states, right?
Yes. But let's use even more general terminology than that. A king is a title you inherit from your father. You get me? A noble is also a title inherited from your father. Nobles, like king, have special privileges. They have land, private armies. They don't pay taxes, many of them. Now, how do you get to be king? Well, originally your family is elected to be king, and then you pass the title father to son, father to son. How do you get to be a noble with all the same privileges as a king, but not as big, not as wealthy, not as powerful? As kings who don't have strong, complete control over your country, you need allies. People that are skilled in, let's say, banking. You bring them into your administration. How do you reward them? You give them a noble title, which comes with lands, a castle, and certain privileges, like not having to pay certain taxes. Or maybe you need generals to lead your armies. How do you reward them? Noble titles, again, with lands and titles and so on and so forth. And these are passed father to son, father to son. The problem is, over generations, certain noble families become stronger and stronger. They marry other families, they increase their land, their wealth, their private armies, the castles which they live in and possess, making them rather independent. So technically, they are loyal to the king of their country, but they are so powerful that if the king were to go against this noble family, the king would simply lose. That's how weak kings were at this time. That they had to share power with their strongest nobles. In addition to that, these nobles were really the only ones that had the power outside of the capital city. So the kings depended on them to enforce his laws, collect his taxes. But like I said, many of these noble families were rather wealthy and independent, and sometimes they just didn't. And what would the king do? Just, what are you going to do? You can't punish them, because you depend on them. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. From?
From the Middle East, like this massive fortunes, are they called noble families too?
Nobility is a generic title, which is used specifically in Europe and in other civilizations they have a variety of other titles, whether it's caste, level, group. But noble is, in Europe, it's a specific title, members of the nobility. In every other culture, there are the same types of basic hierarchy. Those up here, one king, the privileged group here, whether they're nobles or members of the religious orders that control land, that have certain privileges, and the people below that have nothing. They pay all the taxes, do all the work, obey all the laws, obey all the orders. This all changes in the modern era where it becomes everybody is equal in the eyes of the law. Now, this kind of sharing of power got worse when you throw in religion. All right? When you throw in religion, things get worse. Because you have nobles that feel independent because they've got money, they've got power, they got land, and they don't have to take the king's orders. But what happens when the noble adopts a different religion than the king? Then the king loses even more control over his territory. More chaos. And then there's war. The Reformation, the period between the struggle between Protestants and Catholics, saw a lot of fighting between Catholics and Protestants. Wars are expensive. Wars mean kings demand more money from their people. The people don't like paying taxes. And the more you demand of the people, the more they rise up in rebellion, which weakens central authority. The more you demand of your nobles to enforce unpopular laws, the more they resist your authority. The point is, you've got kings that are weak because they share power with their nobles. Kings that are weak because religion that used to bind their people together is now dividing them. And now you have kings that are weak because they're engaged in religious warfare that is costing endless money and making their people even more unhappy. This is the chaos that kings of the late 15 and into the 1600s witnessed, and all of them said, we got to do something. This can't continue. We need somebody to hold everything together. Economics, politics, religion, everything. Because the way it's going, we're coming apart. We have new problems with an old way of organizing our society. So how do we change them? Enter Louis XIV of France. Louis XIV of France is the very model of an absolute king which all other kings wanted to be. Some succeeded, others failed. But everybody tried to have the strong central authority that he had. Now, I like to put up this picture, mostly because I want to give you an idea of what this guy looked like. Clearly, he's wearing a wig. The wig symbolized wealth and privilege, because poor people weren't wearing wigs. They were just working. The outfit is pretty expensive for the time. The leotards, the heels, to us look pretty stupid, but this is the way royalty dressed at the time. It's meant to elevate him over everybody else. Other nobles, religious leaders, and the poor. Because he is at the very top of the pyramid. This is the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France, signifying that he is the king of France. The sword represents that he's also the commander-in-chief, the military leader of France. The scepter, the crown, is a further symbol of his royal authority. This picture, while lovely to look at, is a means of propaganda. When you see this picture, you are getting a message. This is our king. He is better than us. He is more wealthy. He is more worthy. His orders are not meant to be questioned. You can imagine if you had the same guy wearing shorts and a tank top. It wouldn't elicit the same level of respect. Do you know why Catholic churches are so incredibly big and beautiful with the stained glass and the statues and everything. They are meant to impress the worshipers that this is a place where you humble yourself to the glory of God and his followers. You don't walk in there to just say whatever the hell's on your mind. You go in there to submit. This is meant to show you that your role as a subject of France is to submit. So,
Was this painting everywhere in France?
this painting was not mass reproduced. No.
I don't think years ago was it being painted?
I don't know. But I think this one was hung up in Versailles, his palace, where all the most important and powerful came. And so they would see that, and if they didn't get the message, they would clearly know how to relate to the king. Now, King Louis XIV was on the throne from 1643 to 1715. The reason why he got to be so good at what he did is because he had years and years of simply making mistakes and fixing it. Right? He made a mistake and he fixed it. And he had years and years on the throne to do so. Again, what is absolutism? You control every aspect of the government. You are the government. There is no voting. There is no freedom of speech. There is no elections. Society. You are the society. What can people read? Who goes to school? Who doesn't? How do you get married? In what fashion? Taxes to pay? You make the decisions. The economy. All the things I mentioned earlier. One guy makes all the decisions. The law. Well, you make the law. You change the law. You break the law. Who's going to punish you? Nobody. When can you change the law? Whenever you like. Can you make a law to make an action illegal after somebody started doing it when the action was before legal? Yes, you can. Is that fair? No. But who's going to stop you? And culture. What can you read? What can you not read? What music is appropriate? What's not? What paintings are appropriate? What's not? All one guy makes these decisions. So how did Louis XIV go from being, why wasn't he a weaker king like his father, his grandfather, and so on and so forth? What made him different? When Louis XIV came to the throne, he was a kid. He inherited the throne when he was a kid. When young children come to the throne, there's competition for power because an adult has authority. A child, he has the title of king, but he doesn't have authority. Louis XIV, real power was exercised by his ministers. But the ministers, you don't owe allegiance to the minister. You owe allegiance to the king, but not to the ministers. So people are jockeying for position. They're trying to weaken the power of the monarchy, while King Louis XIV is a minor, younger than 18. During that time, when Louis was young, technically on the throne, but a youth, France went through a troubled time, the 30 Years' War. It was a huge war between Catholics and Protestants. It cost a lot of money. France increased taxation during the 30 Years' War. The people resented the extra taxation. The nobles resented having to collect this taxation and to fight these wars. And so, what broke out at the time, what's known as the Fronde, a rebellion against the monarchy. Nobles that opposed the monarchy tried to threaten the king into changing his policy, reducing his demands. Now, it was a failure. But the memory of the challenge to royal authority stayed with King Louis XIV forever. And when he took the throne, he decided to do something about it, to become an absolute monarch and to make sure he and the monarchy of France was never bullied again. How did he do it? He had a few steps, and I'll get to as much as I can before I finish today. The first thing he did was to change the way people thought. You have to convince people they have no right to disagree with you. Well, how do you do that? Louis came up with what's known as, not Louis himself, but his advisors and in his time, they came up with the idea of divine right ideology, which is quite simple. The king is chosen by God to look over God's own children. To disagree with the king is to disagree with God. Meaning, if you disobey the king, you will be punished on earth. But then you will also be punished in the afterlife, because the king represents the will of God. You follow me? Now, this idea was really powerful because at the time, everybody was a practicing Christian, whether Protestant or Catholic, and they believed in hell. So they weren't going to screw around and think that the king is just making stuff up. And this was proclaimed by the king, by his ministers, by his loyal nobles, but also in the churches, by the priests. And the majority of people they had no education. They listened to what was told of them. This was a very powerful way to get people to just simply do what you told them to do. No. Once he took the throne in the majority, as an adult. The other way was these nobles. These nobles that had all this money, private armies, private fortresses. How do you get them to follow your orders and not challenge you? Well, you can kill a couple and set an example. That always works. But you can't kill too many because then you will unify your enemies against you. So what do you do with the rest? You buy them off. You reward them for their loyalty. You give them more lands, titles, favors for their friends. But most importantly, you keep them close. You take them away from their home base where they have their armies, their wealth, their land, their subjects. You keep them close. You make them dependent on you. You make them live with you and beg you for your favors. And as the king, you got lots of favors to give. And where do you make them live? Here. This palace, Versailles, on the outskirts of Paris, the capital of France, is huge. Why? Because King Louis XIV brought all of his friends and enemies there to wait on him, to convince him that they were his friends, to beg him for favors for themselves and their friends and family. And this was incredibly effective. Another way to become less dependent on the nobles for Louis XIV is to hire people that can enforce your laws, collect your taxes, people who had the intelligence to do these things. Before it was only the nobles that had education. But how do you get people that have enough education to be part of your civil service but are dependent on you? Louis was brilliant. Do you know what he did? He looked around and he found the other group of people that had enough money to educate themselves but that were not so independent that he couldn't give them something that would make them loyal to him. Who did he find that were intelligent enough, had the education to be part of his civil service? The middle class. The lawyers, the doctors, the professors, they had the intelligence, they had the wealth, they had the education, but they didn't have access to political power because they didn't have noble titles. So Louis promoted the middle class. He made them nobles dependent on him. So when he gave an order, they obeyed. When he collected taxes, they didn't ask questions, they just did it. And since they were dependent on him, it never occurred to them, to disagree with his ideas, his policies. Can we do religion at the beginning of next class? But before I let you go, and let me stop the recording, and I'll post this on